Welcome back to Art Appreciation, everybody. Continuing our discussion of various artistic mediums. Today we will be getting into mechanical kinds of reproductions in art. And so we'll be talking about printmaking. And so we'll be looking at a variety of different kinds of printmaking, different techniques, and things like that. So jumping in. Generally speaking, artists make prints for one or more of the following reasons. So, to make multiple, less expensive works that will be available to a wider audience. We can make one print image and then pull multiple copies from that, which can, be available to a wider audience for less expensive, means, things like that. Well, we can also use it to influence social causes because of the ease of distribution, through things like posters, pamphlets, and flyers. So, printmaking is not only used for artistic reasons, but also for, political reasons and, all kinds of different things like that, books and, anything that you can think of. But we can also use it as, an interest in the medium or as an art form in and of itself. And so, in the past, it was definitely used for more or less these two things. However, nowadays, we also have artists that work in print medium by itself exclusively as well. Now, printmaking itself describes a variety of techniques developed to create multiple copies of a single image, a series of nearly identical pieces usually printed on paper. So that is the distinguishing factor of printmaking, is that it's multiple copies and it's almost always going to be done on paper because this makes it much more easily distributable. It also makes it cheaper and, all of this kind of stuff. So when we are talking about printmaking, though, we have to first refer to what's known as the matrix. And this is a metal, wood, or stone tablet on which an artist creates an image to be printed. So whatever we actually make the image on is referred to as the matrix. Now, we also have more modern substances such as linoleum, which we see here, which can be used. But in the past, metal, wood, and stone are the major, sources for matrix material, and everything like that. Now, once we've created an image on our matrix, we would then pull from that matrix what's known as the addition. And the addition refers to a group of prints created from the same matrix, which are numbered corresponding to the run of the addition. So if you ever see a print, and here we can see some, they're usually hand signed and numbered right along the bottom edge. And that number might say, like 2 of 50 or something, or 300 of 500 and whatnot. And so this is important because the earlier in the addition it is, usually the better the image quality is. The matrix tends to degrade over time, so the first print pulled from it is going to be really nice, whereas the 1500th print pulled from it might not be quite as nice as the first few. So addition can usually also, or at least the addition run and the edition number can greatly influence the value of a print and things like that. So that's kind of an important misnomer about printmaking in general. Now, aside from the edition, we also have what's referred to as a progressive proof. And this is a print that's pulled during the creation of the matrix to see how the print is developing. So it's important to note that usually when we're creating the matrix, we actually have to make our image in reverse to how we intend it to look once it's printed. So it can be very challenging to see how it's going in that regard. And also, like when we're carving fine metal shavings out of a metal plate, it can be hard to tell how good the contrast is going to be between light and dark once we pull the image. So oftentimes throughout the process, such as we see here, the artist will ink the plate up and then they'll run it just to see where they're at and check their progress. So in this sense, we can see that the first progressive proof here, the artist hadn't done enough, hadn't dug some of those lines out deep enough, so the contrast isn't quite there yet. we can also see that he hadn't really gotten into, you know, detail on like the face of the rooster here or anything. So then he went through and did another, you know, kind of round of work on it and got it up to the right contrast level, and then we can see the final image there on the far right. So this is one way that an artist can kind of check their progress throughout the process, because unlike drawing or painting, it can be very challenging to see how your work is progressing in this moment. Now, something else that we need to talk about in relation to printmaking is what's known as registration. And this is the lining up of multiple blocks to produce one unified image. So many times, printmaking will utilize multiple matrices. So especially when we're doing things like full color prints, lithography, and stuff like that, where every color that we use has to be done on a separate plate or a separate matrix. Well, to then layer all of those up to create one unified image, we have to have them all aligned properly, or we're going to have overshoot and bleeding. So this is where registration comes into play. So many times printmakers will make a template such as we see here, where we know that the plate or the matrix has to fit or be exactly in that area in red, whereas the paper has to touch the edge of the template here for all of them to be lined up perfectly each and every time. So this is very important. If our registration is off, it usually looks kind of weird. If you've ever seen like, the comic strips in the newspaper where, the color kind of bleeds outside of the line a little bit, that's because of bad registration. Now, the technology for printmaking as well as paper making comes to Europe from China originally. These technologies were developed in China during the 9th century CE. So, roughly, the year 800, somewhere in that time period. But what's interesting is, that there are paper-like materials that exist before the Chinese, but paper as we know it today is invented in China during that time. And it's something that we take for granted today. But prior to this, in Europe, vellum was used mostly, and vellum is basically a calf skin that's been scraped down to be paper thin. So it's actually technically leather. The ancient Egyptians used papyrus, in which they would take papyrus reeds and cut thin strips of it, press it and dry it, and then make a kind of paper out of that. But paper as we know it developed in China in the 9th century. And this is kind of a rundown of the process, where we would take plant or other natural materials and we would begin to pulp those materials. And so we would begin to break them down into their individual fibers. And so we see that in this process up here. We would then take those fibers and we would usually also bleach them, which is what's happening in this stage. So they would be suspended in a vat and they would be bleached to get rid of their natural tone and give it a more uniform cream or white kind of appearance. And then from there, we would then suspend that pulp into a water bath. And from there, we would then take a screen and we would scoop up this water or this pulp in the water bath on the screen. We would then allow it to dry, and then it would usually be pressed, and then we would have paper that we could use. And what I find interesting is this is the exact same process that is used to make paper today. However, instead of being handmade like it is here, it's made in big machines and in factories and all that kind of stuff. But the technology really hasn't changed at all. Now, aside from paper making, which is what makes printmaking possible, the Chinese also developed, what comes to be known as relief printing or woodblock printing. And aside from that, they also develop what's known as movable type. And I'm sure you have probably seen movable typeface. It's how newspapers used to be made, where individual letters would be arranged in a big grid, and then we would print that, and then we could change them all out. So, prior to movable type, every single thing that we wanted to print, we would have to hand carve a wood block into that shape. And so here we can see some very early Chinese wood block prints or wood matrices, but once again, we would have to go through and carve out every individual letter. However, During the 11th century, the Chinese invent movable type. So instead of having one block that has, all the characters in it, and we can only print that thing one time, and that's the only thing that we can use from it, they then begin to make individual blocks that have individual characters or images on them that can then be arranged in a grid like this, and then we can print, any and everything that we want over and over and over again, and we can use these over and over and over again versus, say, a wood block like this, which we can use it multiple times, but we can only ever print whatever it might happen to say in that sense. Whereas with this, we have much more options. So here we can see an example of a very early Chinese print image and movable typeface set. So this is the front piece for what's known as the Diamond Sutra. This is a Buddhist sutra from the Tang Dynasty. So this would be Buddhist prayers and things like that. But we can see that movable typeface is being used for our text. And then we also have the addition of a woodcut image, which is added to this as well. Now, it is important to note that a lot of this early printmaking that's done on wood blocks in Asia as well as in Europe, it's fairly limited in what you're able to do with it because of the nature of carving wood and things. So it's usually relegated to very simple black and white like images like we see here. But one of the other things that the Chinese are innovate and come up with utilizing this technology is the first printed money. And if we think in the medieval period where most money is in the form of gold and silver coins, well, it can be very cumbersome to carry around a lot of gold and silver with you, especially considering how heavy gold is. So paper money, once again, a massively influential invention that we take to for granted today, but something that would have been very revolutionary in the 8th, 9th century up into the medieval period. So another kind of major innovation that China's responsible for. However, printmaking was developed in Europe during the 15th century. So it comes to Europe from China via, trade on the Silk Road and everything like that, via about the 1500s. And it really comes into Europe via Germany, but we'll see that in a second. But here we can see the process by which most early European printmaking was done. And so here we can see in the background two typesetters. They're actually making the movable type. And so they're setting the type down. They would then bring the plate over to the inker, who we see here, who would then use these mauls to ink the plate up. We then have another assistant who would then place the paper and then run it through the press. And then we would have 2 pages of a book. And so we would do this over and over and over again until we had every page of the book that we needed. We would then arrange all those pages in the correct order and bind it into the finished product. And so this is how, most printmaking was done, until, at least the Renaissance period, where we start to have the advent of different techniques and things like that. But this is also fairly typical of what most printed imagery would have looked like from this time period. Once again, very simple, black and white, usually uses hatching or cross-hatching extensively in its creation and everything like that. But what we see represented here is the press, the original press, developed by this individual, Johannes Gutenberg. And so this is the man that brings printmaking to Europe for the first time. And this is very influential. And here we can see his actual print press. So this is what we saw in that last image. So we can see our typeface desk over here. We can also see the print press and all of that. But what makes Johannes Gutenberg influential is that the first thing that he ever made prints of was the Bible. And so he makes the first copy of the Bible that wasn't handwritten. And he also makes the first copy of the Bible that was written in a common vernacular language. So prior to Johannes Gutenberg, every single Bible was handwritten and it was handwritten in Latin exclusively. And so it's subject to a lot of major problems in that regard. So, you know, how bad is the guy's handwriting who's writing it? How well are they able to translate between Aramaic and Latin and stuff like that? So there's a lot of deliberate mistranslation that happens and things like that. Versus, say, print face, which, you know, we're using the same typeface over and over and over again, so it can't be misconstrued based on bad handwriting and things like that. So very influential. The other thing that makes this influential is that not only is it written in a common language for the first time, it also makes the Bible much, much cheaper. And so, you know, prior to this, when we're handwriting one, sometimes even kings could not afford one of these Bibles because of how much labor went into them, how expensive they were, and everything like this. Meanwhile, with the printing press, and I apologize about that, we dramatically reduce the cost of making a book. So books start to become more, or they're much more proliferation of books for the first time, beginning with Johannes Gutenberg's printing press. We also start to see that once again, the Bible begins to be printed in languages other than Latin that people can actually read for the first time, and all kinds of things like this. So this is a very influential technology. It's something that we still use today. It's definitely something that we take for granted today, but without this, the world would definitely not be the same place that it is right now. But here we can see a typical example of what a printed book page as well as the imagery would have looked like in the early 1500s when Johannes Gutenberg was doing this. So this would have been what one of his books would have actually looked like. But we can see once again, we have very standardized text, so it makes it easier to read. We also see, once again, that very kind of rudimentary basic imagery. This also coming out of a medieval aesthetic, which is, once again, like the Byzantine aesthetic, not trying to be in competition with the divine. However, it's also responding to the limitations of carving a wood block to make this image and everything like that. But what I find interesting is that printmaking was basically the only way to recreate imagery for many, many centuries. So even up until the middle of the 20th century, printmaking was the only way to recreate things like photographs or, you know, other things like that in a different material or in a different medium. So once again, printmaking was used quite extensively in the realm of things like newspapers, periodicals, and any kind of publishing. Here we can see this is Harper's Weekly. This was the kind of major American newspaper during the middle of the 19th century, especially during the Civil War. So here we can see a nice, kind of printmaking image of Abraham Lincoln there and everything like that. So it also shows, even though early on it's very rudimentary, we can also do a lot of really remarkable things with printmaking, depending on what technique we're using, how much time and effort we're putting into it, and all of that kind of stuff. So now we'll get into several of the different types of printmaking, and there are a few major types, and each type has a few subsets to them. So this might be a little confusing, but we'll try to make it not. So first and foremost, everything that we've seen so far with the Chinese printing, the Johannes Gutenberg printing, all refers to what's known as relief printing. And that is a process where all parts of the matrix not intended to hold ink are cut away and removed, leaving the design in relief at the level of the original surface. So this is usually done on wood block, so it's usually referred to as wood cut. But we can see in the diagram, we would draw our material backwards in reverse on our piece of wood or our surface or matrix, and then we would carve away everything that wasn't the drawing. And then we would ink it and pull the print from that. So the most basic, most rudimentary, all those wood blocks that we saw with the Chinese movable type and everything, that is all a relief printing. And so the most basic form of relief printing is what's known as woodcut. And this is the oldest form of relief printing, and it's a method in which a design is cut into a panel of soft wood. Now this is an important distinction. Woodcut, soft wood, okay? But here we can see a pretty typical, picture. Here we see a guy actually doing a woodcut, but it is a woodcut image itself. That's coming from the studio of Johannes Gutenberg as well. But once again, fairly typical of that time period. So because wood is kind of challenging to carve, especially depending on what type of wood we're using, most of these woodcut images are going to be much more simple and utilize hatching and cross hatching like we see here. But here we can see kind of a breakdown of that. So here we can see a wood panel or a wood matrix, and the artist has gone in and drawn the material or the image in black on top, and then they're using a series of very sharp, kind of tools to carve away everything except for that black design. So because all of everything besides the black is carved away, when we roll ink across it, the ink will only stick to those black areas, and therefore that will be the only thing in the image that will be translated onto paper. So this can be a very meticulous kind of technique to use. It's also kind of challenging in that if you slip once with that knife, you basically have to start all over from scratch. So it's very unforgiving, but we can do some remarkable things with it as well. So once again, here we can see what a lot of printed material would have looked like in the early 1500s. So very simple, very rudimentary, black and white kinds of line imagery. These are usually also used to illustrate books and things like that. So it has to be a little simple because the smaller it is, the much more difficult it is on a wood block to cut out and everything like that. But we can do more advanced examples of this. So here we see Hans Holbein's one of his prints from the series he does called the Danse Macabre, or where it's kind of related to how death interacts with us. But once again, we can see that use of hatching and cross hatching, even contour hatching in this sense, to create a little bit more realistic and more defined kind of image than, say, our previous one. But it's still using a lot of the same aesthetic trends in that regard as well. However, we can be much more detailed with this. Our friend Albrecht Dürer, who we saw a little bit last time, is really well known for his woodcut prints. In fact, he does a huge number of them, a lot of them. He does one of the first popular series of illustrations for the Bible. Here we can see one of my personal favorites. This is the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse from the Book of Revelation. But we can see once again he's using hatching and contour hatching to create a much more vividly realistic image. And so once again, depending on how much time we put into it, we can create much more detail and much more contrast and things like that. But once again, he does quite a few of these. So here we can see another example. This is Samson slaying the lion, also biblical story. Once again, remember, Samson has the long hair that gives him godly power and all that. But once again, we can see, this really nice use of cross-hatching and contour hatching to create, illusionistic space. We can see that that atmospheric perspective is being present in this as well. But once again, we can do quite a bit with wood cut if we are willing to put in the effort with it. But just another example by Albrecht Dürer. Once again, he's probably the most well-known woodcut artist in history, but here we can see another one of his more famous examples, the rhinoceros here and everything. So we can get down into fairly minute details, but it's also important to note that this print is it's fairly large. The matrix would have been fairly large compared to, say, some of those other ones, which might have been fairly small and all of that. Now, aside from Europe, woodcut is also extensively used in Asia, and in particular in Japan for what's known as yukoi-e. And so we saw this image a little earlier, so very famous image. But what I find interesting about yukoi-e prints and woodcut in general is that there are two prevailing techniques, in that we would either use one matrix where we would gradually remove material away from it, and we would pull prints as we work through it. So each color would be done separately. So in that case, if we were doing this on one single image, we would start off by just carving out where the this kind of darker panel in the back was. And then we would print as many in the edition as we were going to. Then we would carve a little bit more away, and we would gradually, get further and further down until only, say, maybe like the boats or the little people are left. And then once, we print that, then the block doesn't exist anymore, and we can no longer pull images from it. So it's almost like a self-regulating kind of thing, in that after we've carved the block all the way down, we only have the number of prints in the initial edition, and we can't make more from them. Otherwise, we would have to carve each individual color that we see here on a different wood block. And so that's where registration would come into play. So in this case, we have, the white is the white of the paper, but we have, at least 5 different colors. So we would have to create 5 different matrices that all lined up perfectly. And then we'd have to go through and print off of that. So that's kind of an interesting aspect of Japanese woodcut printing in general, as opposed to, say, European, which tends to be more simple and black and white and everything like that. But these are what are referred to as the yukoi, or which is literally means the floating world. And these are prints that are done of kind of fleeting aspects of life, of daily life, popular entertainment, all kinds of things like this. So we usually have a lot of these Japanese prints portray, like women in their finery, or doing your makeup, and just daily kinds of things, popular theater, all kinds of stuff like that, even landscapes such as we see here. But once again, it's important to note that this particular image would have been done on either, multiple plates, one for each individual color that you see, or done, on one plate, and we would kind of gradually eliminate information as we created the print itself. But they vary in intensity and representation. Here we can see these are kabuki theater actors, so very prominent aspect of many of these yukoi prints as well. But some of them also show, mythology and other things like that. I also like that some of them show movements across multiple panels, such as we see here. So this is a scene taken from a kind of Japanese myth in which, this kind of noble samurai warrior is trying to, fend off the advances of this witch who summons this giant skeleton demon, and, all this. But some of these types of prints, which show movement across multiple matrices, also, I believe, have a major influence on, contemporary Japanese art styles like manga and anime and all of these kinds of things. So it's kind of interesting. However, we do also have contemporary people dealing with woodcut as well, or more contemporary people. Here we see one of the other more famous examples. This is Kathy Kalowitz, and a self-portrait by her. She's a very interesting artist. She is German by birth, but a lot of her work deals with grief and loss, as well as this kind of maternal spirit. Her oldest son died in the First World War, and so a lot of her work deals with that, like, grief that a mother feels for the loss of their child, and things like that. But it also really highlights kind of the stark quality that woodcut print is really well known for, especially in like the European tradition. So we have this very stark kind of black and white approach, but we can also see that cross-hatching being used in this sense. Now, aside from woodcut, we also have what's known as wood engraving, and this is a process similar to woodcut prints, although the matrix is made out of hardwood, which allows for greater detail and shading, as well as a larger edition run. So in woodcut, we're using a soft wood, and because it's soft, it tends to degrade easier as we run it through a printing press, and so we can only do so many prints off of one of them. Versus wood engraving, and once again, woodcut, soft wood, wood engraving, hardwood. So, hardwood. But this hardwood allows for greater detail to be carved into it, and it holds up better to the pressure of the printing press and all of this kind of stuff. So we can do a lot more crazy things with it. But it's also important to note that not a lot of artists deal with wood engraving as well. They usually use regular engraving on a metal plate, which we'll get into here in a second. But perhaps the greatest wood engraver of all time is a Frenchman named Gustave Doré. He does all kinds of illustration. I mean, he literally does tens of thousands of these woodcut images over his career. And at the time, he was the most in-demand illustrator of all time. And he did basically every major literary work at the time. In fact, his series of illustrations for the Bible, of which we see here, is still to this day the most popular and most famous series of biblical illustrations. But I like this one. I like his work a lot. Once again, he illustrates a wide variety of different subjects, from very serious stuff to more comedy related work. But here we can see a scene of the confusing of tongues from the story of the Tower of Babel. If we're unfamiliar, in the Old Testament, people come together and they try to build this tower to heaven, and in this kind of arrogance, and so for that, God strikes everyone down and makes them all speak gibberish, and so they all kind of disperse and leave it alone. And now this obviously did not happen in real life, but this is a myth that's kind of created to explain why people speak different languages in the world. But I do love Dorer's kind of illustration of that, especially the guy here who's like, why? It's just kind of adds a little bit of a humor to an otherwise very serious kind of image. But perhaps my most famous or my more favorite examples of Dorer's work come from the Divine Comedy, where he's got Dante and Virgil in Dante's Inferno. So here we see a scene from the Inferno in which Dante and Virgil communicate with the gluttons in the third ring of hell and all of that. But once again, much more serious kind of connotation there. But he also is really well known for doing these kind of more humorous things. So here we can see one of his illustrations from Don Quixote. So we see Don Quixote, tilting against the windmill while Sancho Panza is kind of there in the back. But usually I think it's interesting his more lighthearted work takes on a more caricature-esque feeling such as this, whereas his more serious work is more realistic and more, kind of somber and everything like that. But once again, he's really, really accurate. We can see he's also using hatching and cross-hatching quite extensively to create all of these different effects. But once again, really, really, different quality between woodcut and wood engraving. So much, much finer detail and shading and all of these kinds of things. Now, in addition to that, we also have what's known as lino cut. This is the predominant modern relief technique, which utilizes linoleum or other synthetic surfaces, allowing for a really extremely fine detail. I don't have any pictures of lino cut for you because it's almost indistinguishable from woodcut once you actually pull a print. But it's done in the same way as woodcut. The only difference being that linoleum and synthetic surfaces are easier to work with. You might have done a lino cut if you ever did any kind of printmaking in like high school or something like that. It's very, very commonly used in schools and things like this. Now, aside from relief printing, we also have what's known as intaglio. So this is our second major technique, like overarching technique. And so intaglio refers to the opposite of relief printing, in which the ink is held within the cutout furrows of a metal matrix. So in relief printing, we have a woodcut or a wood block or linoleum block that we then carve everything we don't want to print away from, and we then rub ink onto the surface and then pull it. Whereas in intaglio, everything that we want the image to, where we want the image, we use a metal tool to cut these little metal grooves out of the metal plate. We would then, ink the plate up on top, and then we would wipe the ink off of the excess ink off of the top of the plate, only leaving it down inside the recess of the groove that we cut. So it's the complete opposite. Intaglio is the complete opposite of relief printing. However, there are a few different kinds of intaglio. So our most basic one is engraving. And this is a process in which a metal engraving tool is pushed into a polished metal plate to create a groove, removing narrow metal filings in the process. Excuse me. So here we can see that most engraving is usually done on a copper plate because of how soft copper is. It's very easy to carve as opposed to steel or something else like that. But this tool would be pressed, and once again, it's usually used with hatching or cross hatching to create the image itself. But we would remove these small metal filings, and then we would polish the plate to remove these little burrs that are created through the cut, and then we would wipe ink on it, wipe the excess off, and all the ink situated down in those grooves would then be picked up by our paper. And so engraving is pretty extensive. I guarantee you've seen examples of it. If you have any money in your wallet right now, you have an example of engraving. All of our the imagery on our paper currency is done with engraving, such as the portrait of Washington from the dollar bill here that we see. But so we can see too that it's using cross hatching and that contour hatching to create this kind of illusion of the different planes of the face and all of that. So once again, we can do some remarkable things with this depending on how much time and effort we put into it. But once again, we can do all kinds of things with this. Engraving's been used for a long time. Here we can see a nice early example of engraving from the 1630s, but we have Wilhelm Peniel's St. George slaying the dragon. So, a lot of religious imagery and whatnot. But at the same time, we see cross-hatching making this image as well and all of that. But even though this is a little rudimentary, we can do very realistic things with engraving. And engraving for a long time was the predominant way to recreate a work of art, like a painting, in a different, more easy to reproduce kind of material. So here we can see this is Paulus Pontius's Gaspar de Guzman, Count of Olivares. The Count of Olivares here, he's kind of the Prime Minister of Spain at this time. So very prominent individual. This would have been copied from a portrait of this individual done by Diego Velázquez, who was the court painter to the Spanish king, Philip IV, and very prominent patron of Velázquez here. But so we can also see that we have the addition of other elements here, which are used to kind of cement the prowess of this individual. This would have also been used in official purposes. So, they would have done engravings like this that they could make multiple copies of and send out throughout the kingdom to place in like law courts and things like that. So we would know who the prominent, kind of government officials were within the kingdom at this time. So once again, it's a way that we can recreate artworks much more easily and on a massive scale than, say, having to do like 10,000 painted copies of something, which is very time consuming, very laborious, would also be very expensive. Now, aside from engraving, we also have another technique that's like engraving that's known as dry point. And this is a process similar to line engraving in which a pointed steel or diamond tip tool is used to scratch into a copper plate, leaving a burr or a rough edge, which creates a slightly blurred line as a result of ink becoming trapped underneath the edges of that burr. So if we look at the figure 2 down here, this would be a metal matrix that we would use in etching. So we would, polish the top of it before we rubbed ink down into it and everything like that. Versus, say, in dry point, we, after we carved our image out, we would not polish the plate. So we would leave all these little burrs, from the metal being pushed out, and these would catch a little bit excess ink, and when we pressed it, that ink would spray out from those burrs and create a softer, more blurred edged line. So here we can see an example of that. So here we have our etching lines versus our dry point lines. So we can see that ink has been kind of spread out a little bit extra. Now, it's important to note that not a lot of artists really use dry point on its own. It's usually used in connection with etching or other intaglio methods to create certain effects. But it is something that creates kind of an interesting soft kind of feeling to it. So here we can see an actual full-scale dry point etching. So this only uses dry point, but we can see it has a much softer, much more hazy kind of feeling than, say, some of our very hard, crisp-edged engraving would. So once again, depending on what type of effect that we want, we can use dry point. I feel like it gives it a little bit more of a hand-drawn kind of look to it and everything like that. But here we can see just another example of a dry point print that's using only dry point. And once again, it has a much softer kind of feeling to it. But we're usually going to be using it, with hatching and cross hatching just the same. It's just, once again, a lot of artists will use dry point in connection with other, etching and intaglio methods. But we can also use dry point in association with, other intaglio methods. Here we can see this is Mary Cassatt, the famous female impressionist artist, who's using dry point in connection with aquatint, one of our other intaglio methods that we'll see in a minute. But in this sense, she's also using aquatint for her color in that regard as well. Now, that brings us to our other major intaglio method, and that is etching. And so etching refers to a process by which a copper plate is coated with wax or another acid-resistant material from which the artist draws into, exposing the metal. The plate is then immersed into acid, creating a groove in the exposed metal at various depths depending on the strength of the acid used. So here we can see that. So it's basically the exact same thing as engraving. However, we're letting acid do the engraving for us. Instead, we're just drawing out of this wax material placed on top of the matrix. So etching has a really interesting quality. It has a much more hand-drawn like quality to it. And so it can really register or look like an ink drawing or something like that. So here we have a nice, example by Rembrandt, very prominent early artist to use etching. But we can also see one of his plates here just to illustrate that every printmaking image that we do has to be done in reverse to how we intend it to actually be printed. So once again, this can be very challenging to do. But once again, we can see that depending on how much, or how deep we let the acid etch into that copper plate, it will create more, contrast and everything like this. So just a nice example. Once again, it has a very similar look to engraving. They're usually going to use, hatching and cross-hatching still within this engraved or in this etching process. But here we can see, once again, Rembrandt uses it quite extensively, and we can use it to gain a lot of very minute detail. This is what's known as Christ Preaching, or the 100 guilders print. So this actually originally cost 100 silver guilders. This was the currency of the Dutch Netherlands at the time. But so it would have been a fairly expensive print, but it's also a fairly large print, comparatively speaking. But we can see, some of this kind of idea of how etching is done, and the quality that we can achieve in it, the differences in, contrast and everything that we can get. So we have, much more heavily shadowed versus much lighter kinds of passages and things like that. But, this is something that's not exactly, abandoned. It's used in the past. It's even used today. Here we have a nice example of, by Pablo Picasso. We have various mythical elements of like the Minotaur and everything here. But once again, using that etching and cross-hatching and everything like that in this etched image. But it still has this, once again, this kind of more hand-drawn like approach to it. Now, aside from etching, we also have a process called aquatint, which is also technically an etching technique, but also falls under intaglio as well. And so aquatint refers to an etching process which allows an artist to create shades of gray by sprinkling acid-resistant powders onto an area of the plate to create rough or textured areas, as well as a range of tones. So this is similar to coating the plate in like that wax that we then, kind of draw into, and these are usually used in conjunction with one another. However, in this sense, we would first coat only parts of the plate in these semi, kind of porous materials. Usually it's like a material that has things like sand or other things suspended in it, which then gives us textures and all kinds of other things like that. And so once again, this is usually used in conjunction with etching, such as here we can see Francisco Goya, who we've seen quite a bit of work from already. But this is one of his prints from the Los Caprichos series, which is very heavily critical of Spanish society, in particular the Spanish Inquisition, which was still going on at the beginning of the late 18th, early 19th centuries. This is also getting into the Age of Enlightenment, where scientific thought and rational reasoning is starting to take over, the kind of extreme religious fervor of the past. And so here we can see this is the sleep of reason produces monsters. And this is kind of a dig at, the Catholic Church burning people alive for being witches and, all this kind of nonsense, which is, not true. But in this, we can see the use of that aqua tint here, especially in the background, to create this kind of grainy gray surface. And then on top of that, the artist has then gone in and used etching to create the line work that's on top. But we can also see he's used two different, aqua tint materials to create a difference between this darker, more heavily textured background and these kind of lighter, shaded passages on some of the figures in the foreground there. But here we can see just another one of these series or prints from Los Caprichos. Once again, this is specifically related to the Spanish Inquisition. So this would be a heretic having, his sentence read out to him before being condemned and everything like that. But once again, we can see that aqua tint being used quite extensively in the background there. But many artists use this, and once again, they usually use it in connection with not only etching, but things like dry point and other intaglio methods. Here we can see a print by our friend Otto Dix from his Der Krieg print series. Once again, related to his experiences in the First World War. But this is an interesting print in my opinion, not only because it shows a certain level of horror, but it also has not only engraving, etching, but also dry point and aqua tint all present in one image. So we can see the aqua tint being used in the background for some of that shading and some of this kind of speckling quality. We can then also see our other three major, line intaglio methods being used to create different effects within the line work of the figures here as well. And another artist that uses a lot of these intaglio methods in connection with one another is our friend Kathy Kalowitz again. So here we can see just another one of her works that's making heavy use of etching and aqua tint once again. The etching being used for the line work and the aqua tint being used for the shading. A little bit more ominous in this case, I feel. I think she's also using dry point in this particular one as well. But once again, we can use all of these different methods in conjunction with one another to create a variety of different kinds of effects. Now, that brings us to one of our newer forms of printmaking. So, relief printing goes all the way back to the 9th century. Intaglio methods are largely developed during the Renaissance period. And then during the 18th century, we had the development of lithography. So, this is a process. It's developed in the 18th century, but it's really perfected during the 19th century, and it's based on the mutual antipathy of oil and water. So unlike etching, where we're carving out of a metal plate in one way or another, in this sense, we're actually creating an image in wax on a stone surface, and then we use that wax kind of holds the ink in place, and we use water to wipe the ink away from all of the places where the wax isn't holding it, and that creates our contrast between black and white. So most lithography is done on limestone, such as we see here. This is a lithography stone. These are very, very heavily polished to almost a mirror-like finish on the surface. And then we would use this wax-like material to then draw onto them. So lithography is very interesting in that regard, in that because we're using a crayon-like substance to draw with on the stone, it has a very hand-drawn like quality. And we can also use that to very, very accurately recreate things like paintings or drawings or anything within this material. So this is the predominant way, lithography is the predominant way from the 19th century even into the modern day, even today, that images are recreated in printmaking. So once again, this is based on the mutual antipathy of oil and water. So we can see here the image is done in this wax material on the surface of the stone. Then we would use a material known as tapum to then, kind of brush it. We would then ink the plate, and the ink would only stick to that wax and tapum surface. And then we would wipe it again a few times and re-ink and wipe until all of the wax was covered and all of the area of the stone not intended to hold the ink was completely clean. So the tapum acts as a kind of barrier as well. But we would do this and go back and forth. But it's also important to note that we would have multiple stones and we would use one stone per color. So every color that we used in a lithography print would have an individual stone for it. And once again, our registration would have to be really, really well in that regard. But here we can see a kind of basic layout. So here we can see, the lithography stone and then the print pulled from the lithography stone. So once again, we can be very detail oriented in it. No matter, anything that we can do with, hand-drawn quality, we can also do with lithography. So one of the earliest lithographers that's really well known is a man named John James Ottoburn, and very famous. You can actually still buy books of his prints today. But he went all throughout the Americas and he did this massive series of prints and lithography prints based on the fauna, like the bird life of the Americas. And all of these prints are life-size. They're massive in scale. This particular one is, I want to say, 3 or 4 feet tall. So it's the actual size of a real flamingo. But, if we look at this, we can see the quality in it. But you can also look at it and say every single one of these colors that you see has its own lithography stone associated with it. So this print has probably at least 20 to 25 different stones used just to make this one image. And so he also made, several hundred of these images. So really, really laborious kind of process. But we can see just what kind of quality we can achieve with this lithography process. This is also one of the first printmaking methods in Europe that really allows for full color. Now we saw those Yukoe prints that are in full color, but they tend to be kind of broken up and a little more exaggerated, unrealistic. However, lithography allows for some of the first really accurate, realistic color reproductions of an image. And so once again, from the 19th century even to today, if we wanted to reproduce a painting in color, this is how it would be done. But here we can see just another example of lithography by another famous artist to do these kinds of, animal prints and things of various exotic wildlife. So this is Ernst Haeckel's Art Forms of Nature, the Sea Anemones. So once again, we can have a huge amount of detail in this. This particular print has probably, I want to say, at least 50 stones in it. So every single color you see has its individual stone. So once again, we can be extremely, extremely meticulous with this if we want to be. However, lithography is also really well known for doing things like poster and advertising kinds of printmaking. So here we can see a print by a famous post-impressionist artist named Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, and a lot of his paintings and his artwork in general, as well as many of his lithographs, are all based on the Moulin Rouge, which was the kind of famous French nightclub in Paris in the late 19th century. But a lot of his lithography also, promoted shows that they would have there. He did a lot of work for this. I can't remember her name right at the top of my head. but she was a very famous kind of dancer, performer in France at the time, but he did a lot of work for her shows in that regard. But once again, all of these, the different colors that you see were all done on different blocks. So there's, I want to say, like 5 different blocks or stones used in this particular image. But once again, he does a lot of these very famous posters. I'm sure you maybe have seen some of these before. But once again, a lot of famous theater and stage kinds of shows are done with these lithographic posters. A lot of movie posters were done this way as well, even up into, nowadays. If you go see the big posters, outside of the movie theater, I guarantee that they're done with lithography. But a little bit more modern version of lithography, but still. So another nice example by Toulouse-Lautrec there. But once again, we have a wide variety of different kinds of lithography that can be done. And so we can have, very naturalistic, realistic kinds of images. We can have more graphic types of images. But we can also have lithographs that have this kind of hand-drawn approach to them, such as M.C. Escher's work here. I'm sure we've seen works like this before. This is a very parodied artwork, but once again, he's using cross-hatching, and he's created a lithograph that has a much more kind of pencil drawing-like approach to it, or look to it. Now, what I also find interesting about lithography is that it has a photographic method in which we can take a metal plate, such as we see here, that's coated in a light-sensitive material, and we can expose it to a photographic negative and burn that material, and then affix it, and then we can reproduce photographs with lithography as well. And so this is something that's developed with the advent of photography as well. But if you've ever seen a photograph recreated in a magazine or a book or anything like that, I guarantee this is how it's done with photolithography. And nowadays, we don't necessarily have, a bunch of these giant limestone blocks that we're using. We're actually doing it on these metal plates like this, these very thin metal plates. But they're usually also done in these large scale, 3-color presses and things like that. So almost all advertising material is done with lithography in a press like this nowadays, as opposed to on individual stones and things like that. So once again, though, lithography, a little bit newer method, but it's still something that we use quite extensively today. Now, aside from that, the newest, printmaking form is screen printing. And screen printing is based on the idea of the stencil, which is a sheet with a design cut out of it. We should be familiar with what a stencil is. But screen printing is a process by which a stencil is fixed to a porous fabric adhered to a frame, through which ink is strained by running a squeegee across the stencil. So screen printing also has a photographic process similar to lithography as well, in which we coat the screen in this light-sensitive material, and then we expose it to light, burn it, and then affix it, and then we can, make a photographic recreation. But it's important to note that, like lithography and recreating photographs or naturalistic images, in lithography we have to have a separate screen for every individual color that we use. But screen printing is something that's very common. I guarantee all of you guys have an example of screen printing in the form of t-shirts and things like that. So most of the time, if you have any kind of t-shirt with like an image or a logo on it, it's almost always going to be screen printed if it's not embroidered or something. But here we can see the basic principle on this. So here we can see our screen. We can see that the stencil has been made on that screen with this green blocking fluid that's been placed on it. And, our stencil is the kind of design there. And then we would lay a bead of ink on, and we would use the squeegee to drag this ink across that stencil, which then pushes it through the screen onto the surface that we want to print on. So it's a fairly basic technology, but what I think is interesting is that, once again, we can do, realistic photographs with this, but we have to break it down into individual colors. So here we can see this is a t-shirt kind of factory, and in t-shirt factories in general, they usually have this big revolving thing with all the individual print or the screens, but we can see an artist with, multiple screens, and we would take the shirt, or whatever, we would run one, squeegee it, let it dry, put it in the second, squeegee, let it dry, squeegee, let it dry, etc., until we get the final product. But aside from things like t-shirts and clothing, one of the major uses of screen printing has always been for things like show posters, particularly like music and concert posters. Definitely beginning in the 1960s with like the psychedelic movement. So here we can see one such. This is a band poster promoting a show for the Doors. There in like the late 60s. And everything like that. But once again, it tends to take on a more kind of graphic style and things like that. But this is something that's still done even to this day. Here we can see a show poster for a band I like called Wolves in the Throne Room. But once again, it's important to note that every individual color you see here is a separate screen. Sometimes, though, the white would be the white of the paper, that kind of thing, and everything like that. But it just depends on what kind of effect we want to do. Now, aside from that, we also have screen printing used for a variety of different things. I'm sure you recall seeing this image a while back. This was by a street artist named Shepard Fairey, who's also responsible for the Andre the Giant Obey sign and everything, which you might have seen as well. But, once again, screen printing usually lends itself to very kind of simple graphic types of renderings such as this. Once again, very parodied kind of image. Shepard Fairey actually got in a lot of trouble for using this without permission. So you should always be aware of copyright laws and things like that before you steal someone else's image. Just as a heads up. But not a lot of artists really use screen printing outside of things like t-shirts, show posters, propaganda posters, things like that. It's usually more of a utilitarian art form, but we do have artists such as Andy Warhol who really embrace screen printing, and he also brings it to prominence because of, he's very interested in this mechanical kind of reproduction in terms of, using mass commodification as the main basis of his artwork. So I'm sure we're all familiar with like Andy Warhol's, Campbell's Soup and a lot of his other works of art. Not only is he using screen printing to recreate this idea of, mass consumer goods, but he also uses it to, kind of talk about the consumer quality of celebrity status and things like that. Here we have the three Elvis or triple Elvis. So once again, Elvis was kind of a massive celebrity back in his day. Not only was he a singer, musician, but he was also in a bunch of really crappy B movies, and all this kind of thing. But there was a time where he was, essentially the superstar of his day, and you couldn't have really gone anywhere without seeing his face. And so this, kind of work, it's, as we have the screen print starting to degrade, it's almost commenting on that, mass commodity kind of culture surrounding celebrity and all of this kind of idea. And we'll talk a little more about Andy Warhol with pop art later on as well. But, here we can see just another example of some of his work using screen printing. So here we have Chairman Mao Zedong, the first Chinese communist dictator there. Very, kind of horrific character. He's probably even worse than Hitler and Stalin combined. But once again, he's, Andy Warhol does a lot of this work based on Mao Zedong, which is kind of playing up this kind of irony in his cult status, if you will, despite the fact that he was probably the most brutal dictator that's ever walked the face of the earth. But that's a whole different story. But once again, we can see, screen printing here being used to recreate, the image over and over again, and then also being used to comment on this kind of commodification of celebrity. In this case, this kind of cult of personality that's established by many of the communist dictators and things like that. But, Andy Warhol, also well known for doing all kinds of things. Here we can see this is the album cover he did for the Velvet Underground, but I've seen this image recreated on everything from t-shirts to tote bags to, anything you could think of. And I personally think Andy Warhol would be quite tickled by that if he was still alive today. But once again, just the kind of ubiquitous quality of screen printing in our modern world is a major aspect of printmaking in general today. So that's what I've got for you for today for printmaking. Next time we will talk about photography. So thanks for joining me. We'll see you guys next time.